Karen Lewis sat in the green room of the night show with Steve Collins, trying to calm her nerves. As the new spokesperson for Senator Richard Miller's presidential campaign, this was her first major television appearance. At only 27 years old, she was one of the youngest press secretaries to ever work on a presidential campaign. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled, and her navy blue suit was free of wrinkles. She looked ready, but inside, her stomach was in knots. 5 minutes, Ms. Lewis, a production assistant called through the door. Karen took a deep breath and checked her notes one last time. She had prepared for every possible question about Senator Miller's controversial tax plan. The campaign was facing criticism from both sides of the political spectrum, and tonight's interview would be crucial for damage control. The green room door opened, and Brad Wilson, her media advisor, stepped in. "Remember, stay calm and stick to our talking points," Brad said. "Collins likes to throw curveballs, but don't let him rattle you." Karen nodded. "I've watched all his interviews from the past month. I know his tactics." "Good. Just remember, this isn't a friendly chat. It's a chance to deliver our message to millions of viewers," Brad replied, checking his watch. "They're ready for you." A different production assistant, a young woman with bright red hair, appeared at the door. "We're ready for you, Ms. Lewis." Karen followed the assistant through the maze-like hallways of the studio. The sound of the audience's applause grew louder as they approached the stage. From behind a curtain, she could see Steve Collins warming up the crowd with jokes. He was a tall man with salt and pepper hair and glasses, known for his sharp wit and even sharper questions. "And now please welcome Karen Lewis, spokesperson for Senator Richard Miller's presidential campaign," Steve announced. The audience applauded politely as Karen walked onto the stage with a confident smile. She shook Steve's hand and took her seat on the blue couch across from his desk. "Thank you for having me," Karen said, her voice steady despite her nervousness. "Thanks for being here," Steve replied with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "So Senator Miller's tax plan has been described by economists as ambitious at best, reckless at worst. Care to comment?" Karen was prepared for this opening. What economists call reckless, everyday Americans call necessary change. Senator Miller's plan will reduce the tax burden on middle-class families by an average of $3,000 per year. But according to the National Budget Office, the plan would add $2 trillion to the national debt over the next decade, Steve countered. "Those projections don't account for the economic growth the plan will generate," Karen responded smoothly. "When people have more money in their pockets, they spend it. That creates jobs and expands the economy." Steve leaned forward. "So you're saying the National Budget Office, a nonpartisan agency, is wrong in their analysis?" "I'm saying their analysis is incomplete," Karen replied, maintaining her composure. "They're looking at static numbers without considering the dynamic effects of tax relief." The interview continued with Steve pressing Karen on various aspects of the tax plan. The tension in the studio grew with each exchange. What was supposed to be a 10-minute segment stretched to 15 as neither side was willing to back down. "Let's move on to Senator Miller's comments about immigration," Steve said, changing topics. "Last week he suggested building a wall along the northern border as well. Is that still the campaign's position?" Karen felt a drop of sweat on her forehead. This wasn't on her prep sheet. Senator Miller had made that comment off the cuff at a rally, and the campaign had been trying to distance itself from it. "Senator Miller believes in secure borders north and south," Karen began cautiously. "However, different borders require different security measures. The comment about a northern wall was meant to illustrate his commitment to comprehensive border security." "So no northern wall?" Steve pressed. "The campaign is focused on practical solutions, not specific structures," Karen replied, trying to pivot. "What's important is addressing the root causes of illegal immigration while creating pathways for legal entry." Steve wasn't satisfied. "That's not what the senator said, though, is it? He specifically called for, and I quote, a big, beautiful wall from Maine to Washington state. That sounds like a specific structure to me." The audience laughed, and Karen felt her face grow warm. "Campaigns evolve, Steve." The senator's comment was made in the context of a broader discussion about national security, Karen said, trying to regain control of the narrative. Speaking of evolving, Steve continued, pulling out a tablet. Here's a clip of Senator Miller from just 2 years ago, opposing any new border structures. Let's watch. The screen behind them played a video of Senator Miller at a town hall meeting, saying, "Walls are a medieval solution to a modern problem. We need smart technology, not dumb barriers." When the clip ended, Steve turned to Karen with a raised eyebrow. "That's quite an evolution in a short time, wouldn't you say?" Karen felt ambushed. This clip hadn't been in her briefing materials, either. She took a sip of water to buy herself a moment to think. "Politics is about responding to changing circumstances," she finally said. 2 years ago, border crossings were at a historic low. Now they're at a historic high. Different situations require different responses. "So principles change based on poll numbers?" Steve asked. The audience reacted with a mix of applause and murmurs. Karen could feel the interview slipping away from her. She needed to regain control. "That's a cynical way to frame it, Steve," Karen said, her voice firmer now. "Senator Miller's core principle has always been the safety and security of the American people. The methods to achieve that may adapt to current realities, but the principle remains constant." Steve nodded, seemingly impressed by her recovery. "Fair enough. Let's talk about the senator's climate policy, or lack thereof." The conversation shifted to environmental issues, another contentious topic for the campaign. Senator Miller had previously called climate change an expensive hoax, but had recently started acknowledging its reality while opposing most measures to address it. As the interview neared the 30-minute mark, twice its scheduled length, a producer gave Steve a signal from offstage. "We need to wrap up," Steve said, "but I have one more question. Senator Miller has called for unity while simultaneously referring to his opponents as enemies of the state. How do you reconcile these contradictory messages?" Karen took a deep breath. This was dangerous territory. Senator Miller distinguishes between political opponents, who he respects as part of the democratic process, and those who he believes are actively undermining American values and institutions. "And who decides which is which?" Steve asked. "The American people will decide in November," Karen replied. "That's a non-answer," Steve pressed. "The senator has explicitly called members of the opposing party enemies of the state. That's not unity language." Karen felt her professional demeanor starting to crack. "If you're going to cherry-pick quotes without context, I'm happy to provide context," Steve interrupted, reaching for more notes. "Here's the full quote from his rally last month." The tension in the studio was palpable as the first commercial break approached. Karen knew this interview was not going as planned, and the worst was yet to come. The producer signaled for a commercial break. Karen felt a wave of relief as Steve turned to the camera with his signature smile. "We'll be right back with more from Karen Lewis after these messages," he said cheerfully. As soon as the camera stopped rolling, Karen's smile disappeared. She reached for her water glass with a slightly shaking hand. The studio lights were hot and she could feel sweat beginning to form on her back. "You're doing great," a voice said from the side of the stage. It was Brad, her media advisor, who rushed over with a concerned look on his face. "He's trying to trap me," Karen whispered. That northern wall comment was taken completely out of context. "I know," Brad said, handing her a small towel to dab her forehead. "But you're holding your ground. Just remember, when he brings up the donation scandal, pivot to the senator's charity work." Karen's eyes widened. "What donation scandal?" Brad's face fell. "The news just broke during the first segment. Miller's campaign received $500,000 from Global Energy Partners. They're under federal investigation for fraud." "And you're just telling me this now?" Karen hissed, trying to keep her voice down. "It just hit the wires," Brad said defensively. "I only found out during the climate change segment." 30 seconds, called the floor director. Brad squeezed Karen's shoulder. "You can handle this. Just say the campaign is reviewing all donations and will return any funds from inappropriate sources." Before Karen could respond, Brad was ushered off the stage. She quickly pulled out her phone to search for information about Global Energy Partners, but there wasn't enough time. She would have to improvise. And we're back with Karen Lewis, spokesperson for Senator Richard Miller's presidential campaign. Steve announced as the cameras began rolling again. His expression had changed. There was a gleam in his eye that made Karen nervous. Ms. Lewis, news broke during our first segment that Senator Miller's campaign received $500,000 from Global Energy Partners, a company currently under federal investigation for fraud and tax evasion. Can you comment on that? Karen felt her mouth go dry. She took a quick sip of water. The campaign takes all allegations of financial impropriety very seriously, she began, falling back on practiced language. We are currently reviewing all of our donations and will return any funds that came from inappropriate sources. Steve nodded. So you're saying you didn't know that Gregory Abbott, the CEO of Global Energy Partners, is Senator Miller's former college roommate? This information has been public for years. Karen felt like the floor was dropping beneath her. This was the first she had heard of any connection between Senator Miller and Gregory Abbott. She scrambled to remember if this had been in any of her briefing materials. The senator has many friends from his college days, she said carefully. But friendship does not override the campaign's commitment to ethical fundraising. Interesting, Steve said, looking down at his notes. Because Senator Miller sponsored 3 bills that directly benefited Global Energy Partners during his time in the Senate. Do you see how this might look like a quid pro quo? The audience murmured. Karen could feel the situation slipping further out of her control. Senator Miller has sponsored hundreds of bills during his career, she countered. Many of them benefit American businesses and create jobs. That's what good legislation does. But most American businesses don't donate $500,000 to his campaign, Steve pressed. Most American businesses aren't run by his former roommate. Most American businesses aren't under federal investigation. Karen felt a flash of anger. You're implying something without evidence, Steve. That's not journalism, that's gossip. The audience reacted with a mix of applause and gasps. Steve seemed momentarily taken aback by her direct challenge. I'm asking questions based on facts, he replied, his tone hardening. The donation is a fact. The friendship is a fact. The legislation is a fact. The federal investigation is a fact. What conclusion would you draw from these facts? I would draw the conclusion that you're trying to create a scandal where none exists, Karen said, her voice rising slightly. Senator Miller has always acted in the best interests of the American people. His record speaks for itself. Let's talk about that record, Steve said, smoothly changing tactics. Senator Miller voted against the Clean Rivers Act, which would have prevented companies like Global Energy Partners from dumping waste into our waterways. Global Energy Partners saved millions because of that vote. The senator received a $200,000 donation the following month. Again, these are facts. Karen felt cornered. She had no information about this specific vote or donation. The campaign had prepared her for questions about the tax plan, immigration, and climate change. Not this. I don't have the specifics of that particular vote in front of me, she admitted. But I can assure you that Senator Miller bases his decisions on principle, not politics. Which principle justified allowing toxic waste in our rivers? Steve asked. The audience laughed, and Karen felt her face flush with embarrassment and anger. The principle that excessive regulation kills jobs, she snapped. The principle that we need a balanced approach to environmental protection and economic growth. The principle that complex legislation often has unintended consequences that hurt working Americans. Her voice had gotten louder with each point, and she realized she was nearly shouting. She took a deep breath and tried to calm herself. I understand those principles, Steve said calmly. But they seem to apply selectively. Senator Miller has supported regulations that hurt his competitors while opposing those that would cost his donors. That's not principle. That's politics at its worst. Something in Karen snapped. All the preparation, all the careful messaging, all the talking points, none of it had prepared her for this ambush. She leaned forward in her chair. You invited me here under the pretense of discussing the senator's tax plan, she said, her voice trembling slightly with anger. Instead, you've turned this into a hit job based on information you know I haven't been briefed on. That's not fair journalism. My job isn't to be fair to political campaigns, Steve replied. My job is to be fair to my viewers by asking hard, questions and getting honest answers. There's a difference between hard questions and a coordinated attack, Karen said. You didn't just happen to have all this information, you planned this. Steve shrugged. We research our guests, that's our job. And it's my job to recognize when an interview has become an interrogation, Karen said, reaching for her microphone. I think we're done here. The audience gasped as Karen began to unclip her microphone. Steve looked genuinely surprised. Ms. Lewis, we still have several minutes left in the segment, he said. You've had 30 minutes to attack Senator Miller with selective facts and innuendo, Karen replied, standing up. I don't think a few more minutes will make this any fairer. The studio fell silent as Karen removed her microphone and placed it on the coffee table between them. She could see the floor director frantically signaling to Steve from off camera. This was not how television interviews were supposed to end. Steve Collins rose from his chair, a mix of surprise and irritation on his face. This had never happened in his 15 years of hosting The Night Show. Guests had gotten angry before, but none had ever tried to walk off mid-interview. Ms. Lewis, he said, his voice calm but firm. I understand you're upset, but leaving now will only make this situation worse for your campaign. Karen paused. She knew he was right. Walking off would create headlines that would overshadow Senator Miller's message for weeks. Miller spokesperson storms off stage, would be on every news website by morning. Still, she couldn't sit there and continue to be ambushed with questions she wasn't prepared to answer. Then let's reset, she said, not sitting back down. Let's talk about the tax plan, which is what I was told this interview would focus on. The audience was completely silent, watching the drama unfold. Even the cameramen seemed frozen in place. Fair. Enough, Steve said, gesturing to her seat. Let's talk about the tax plan. But I can't promise not to return to these other issues which are relevant to voters. Karen hesitated, then slowly sat back down and reattached her microphone. She smoothed her skirt and took a deep breath. Senator Miller's tax plan will benefit millions of working-class Americans, she began, trying to regain control of the narrative. Before we get to that, Steve interrupted, I want to be clear about something. My team provides all guests with a general outline of topics that will be covered. Your team was informed that we would discuss the tax plan, immigration, climate policy, and campaign finance. We didn't ambush you. Karen's eyes narrowed. If that's true, then my team failed to prepare me properly. Either way, I'm at a disadvantage. Here. Welcome to politics, Steve said with a small smile. Now about that tax plan. Independent analysts say it will increase the deficit by $3 trillion over 10 years. How do you respond to that? Karen launched into her prepared answer about economic growth and job creation. For a few minutes, the interview returned to something resembling normal, but Karen could sense that Steve was just waiting for the right moment to strike again. Let's talk about Senator Miller's position on health care, Steve said, changing topics again. Karen inwardly sighed with relief. Healthcare was another area she had been thoroughly briefed on. Senator Miller believes that every American deserves access to quality, affordable healthcare, she began. But the current system is broken. Our plan will reduce costs without sacrificing quality by repealing the Affordable Care Act, Steve interrupted. By replacing it with a more effective system, Karen corrected. One that preserves coverage for pre-existing conditions but reduces the regulatory burden that has driven up costs. But Senator Miller voted against protecting pre-existing conditions 3 times in the Senate, Steve said, reading from his notes. Karen felt her frustration, building again. Those votes were against specific bills that had many other problematic provisions. The senator's healthcare plan clearly states that pre-existing conditions will be protected. So he was against it before he was for it? Steve asked with a raised eyebrow. The audience laughed, and Karen could feel her carefully maintained composure starting to crack again. Politics isn't that simple, and you know it, she said. Bills are complex. They contain hundreds of provisions. Voting against a bad bill that happens to contain one good provision doesn't mean you oppose that provision. Fair point, Steve conceded. But let's be honest here. Senator Miller has flip-flopped on health care, immigration, climate change, and numerous other issues. When voters look at his record, how can they know what he truly stands for? Karen leaned forward. They can know by listening to what he's saying right now. In this campaign, people evolve. Their thinking changes based on new information and experiences. That's not a weakness, it's wisdom. For the first time in the interview, a portion of the audience applauded her answer. Karen felt a small surge of confidence. Speaking of evolution, Steve said, let's talk about the senator's religious views and how they inform his policies. Karen tensed. Religion was always dangerous territory in politics. Senator Miller is a man of faith, she said carefully, but he believes strongly in the separation of church and state. His policies are based on what's best for all Americans, not just those who share his religious beliefs. Then why did he tell a group of evangelical donors, and I quote, "When I'm president, we'll finally put God back in the driver's seat of this country," Steve asked. Karen hadn't heard about this quote. She wondered if it was real or taken out of context. I haven't heard that specific quote, she admitted, but I know the senator believes that moral principles should guide leadership. That's not the same as imposing religious doctrine. The distinction seems fuzzy, Steve said, especially when he's promised to appoint judges who will respect traditional values, widely understood as code for overturning certain Supreme Court decisions. Karen could see where this was heading and tried to steer the conversation back to safer ground. The senator respects the independence of the judiciary, she said. He simply believes that judges should interpret the Constitution as written, not legislate from the bench. Let's talk about women's rights, Steve said, ignoring her attempt to change topics. Senator Miller has said he would support a national ban on The senator believes these issues should be decided at the state level, Karen interrupted, reciting the campaign's official position. He trusts the American people to make these decisions through their elected state representatives. But that's not what he said last month at the Values Voter Summit, Steve countered. He explicitly called for national legislation. Karen felt like she was playing whack-a-mole. Every time she addressed one issue, Steve brought up another contradiction or controversy she wasn't prepared for. The senator's position has been consistent, she insisted, even though she was no longer sure. If that was true, states should decide these sensitive social issues. Steve looked down at his notes again. I have at least 5 quotes here that suggest otherwise. Would you like me to read them? What I'd like, Karen said, her voice tight with controlled anger, is for you to acknowledge that you're not conducting an interview. You're conducting a cross-examination, the audience murmured, and Steve looked up from his notes with surprise. My job is to ask difficult questions, he said, particularly of those seeking power. There's a difference between difficult questions and a predetermined narrative, Karen replied. You've made up your mind about Senator Miller and nothing I say will change that. That's not true, Steve said. I'm simply asking for consistency and honesty. No, you're asking for perfection, Karen shot back. Show me a politician who has never changed a position or made a mistake, and I'll show you someone who has never learned or grown. The audience applauded again, louder this time. For a moment, Karen thought she might have turned the tide of the interview. But Steve Collins hadn't become the king of late-night political interviews by backing down easily. Steve leaned back in his chair, a slight smile on his face. You make a good point about growth and learning, Ms. Lewis. So let's talk about growth. Has Senator Miller grown in his understanding of climate change? Karen felt like she was walking into another trap, but climate change was a topic she had been well briefed on. Yes, he has. Like many Americans, the senator's views on climate change have evolved as the science has become clearer. So he no longer believes it's a hoax created by China to hurt American manufacturing, Steve asked. Because he tweeted that exact phrase 16 times between 2018 and 2020. The senator acknowledges that human activity contributes to climate change, Karen said carefully. His concern has always been that certain climate policies would unfairly burden American workers and businesses. That sounds like a no, Steve said. Does he still believe it's a hoax? Karen felt her patience wearing thin. No, he does not. Believe climate change is a hoax. What he questions is the extreme solutions proposed by some that would destroy millions of jobs. Yet his climate plan, released just last week, includes no concrete targets for emissions reductions, Steve pointed out. It mentions innovation 47 times, but regulation only twice. Critics call it a plan to do nothing while pretending to do something. Those critics haven't read the plan carefully, Karen countered. It includes substantial investment in clean energy research and development. It incentivizes businesses to reduce their carbon footprint through tax credits, and it addresses climate resilience for communities already facing the effects of extreme weather. But it doesn't set any actual goals for reducing emissions, Steve insisted. No targets, no timelines. Because arbitrary targets don't work, Karen said, finally on firm ground with information she had been briefed on. The last administration set ambitious targets and missed every single one. Senator Miller believes in setting realistic goals and actually achieving them. What goals? Steve asked. You just said the plan doesn't include specific targets. Karen realized she had talked herself into a corner. The goals will be developed in consultation with industry leaders, scientists, and environmental experts after the senator is elected. The audience laughed, and Karen knew how that sounded. So the plan is to have a plan? Steve asked, eliciting more laughter. Karen felt her face growing hot again. The plan is to address climate change responsibly, without destroying the economy in the process. Let's move on, Steve said, apparently satisfied that he had made his point. Senator Miller has been critical of the current administration's foreign policy. He's called it weak and embarrassing. What would he do differently? Foreign policy was another area Karen had been thoroughly briefed on. She began to outline the senator's approach to international relations, focusing on his promise to stand up to America's adversaries while supporting its allies. The senator believes in peace through strength, she said. He would increase defense spending to modernize our military, stand firm against aggression from hostile nations, and rebuild relationships with our traditional allies. Interesting, Steve said. Because in 2021 he criticized the previous administration for spending too much on defense. He called for cutting the military budget by 15% and using the money for domestic programs. Another evolution? Karen was getting tired of this pattern. The global situation has changed dramatically since 2021. New threats have emerged. The senator's position reflects that reality. What new threats specifically? Steve asked. The rising aggression from several authoritarian regimes, Karen replied, deliberately keeping it vague since she wasn't sure which specific threats the senator had mentioned in his recent speeches. Can you name one concrete action Senator Miller would take differently from the current administration in dealing with these regimes? Steve pressed. Karen tried to remember the talking points on foreign policy. He would impose stronger sanctions on human rights abusers. He would increase our military presence in strategic regions, and he would make it clear to our adversaries that there are red lines they cannot cross without consequences. Those sound exactly like the policies of the current administration, Steve observed. The difference is that Senator Miller would actually enforce them, Karen said, repeating a line she had heard the senator use at rallies. Can you give an example of the current administration failing to enforce its own policies? Steve asked. Karen was starting to feel exhausted. The interview had been going for nearly an hour now, well beyond its scheduled time. Every answer she gave was met with another challenge, another contradiction to explain away. She wondered how much longer this would continue. The public record speaks for itself, she said, trying to avoid another specific claim that Steve might be able to disprove. That's not an answer, Steve said. If you're going to claim the current administration isn't enforcing its policies, you should be able to provide at least one example. Karen decided to take a risk. The administration threatened severe consequences if the Zovian regime used chemical weapons against its own people. They used them, and what happened? A strongly worded letter from the UN. That's not enforcement. Steve looked genuinely confused. Zovia? I'm not familiar with that country. Karen realized with horror that she had confused a fictional country from their debate prep with a real-world situation. I misspoke, she said quickly. I was referring to Syria. But Steve wasn't letting it go. There have been no confirmed chemical attacks in Syria during this administration. The last one was 3 years ago, under the previous administration. Is there another example you'd like to provide? The audience was completely silent now, watching. Karen squirmed. She could feel sweat running down her back. I may have mixed up the timeline, she admitted, but the point remains that the current administration's foreign policy lacks credibility. Our adversaries don't believe there will be consequences for their actions. Based on what evidence? Steve pressed. Karen felt like she was drowning. Each attempt to explain just got her in deeper. She looked off stage and saw Brad, her media advisor, making a slashing motion across his throat. She wasn't sure if he was telling her to cut off the interview or to stop talking about this topic. Look, she said, deciding to try a different approach. I'm not a foreign policy expert. I'm here to talk about Senator Miller's vision for America. And that vision includes a stronger, more respected position in the world. But that's just a slogan, Steve said. When pressed for specifics, you either can't provide them or offer the same policies as the current administration. How are voters supposed to make an informed choice? By listening to Senator Miller directly, Karen said. He's giving a major foreign policy address next week at the Council on Foreign Relations. I encourage your viewers to watch it. We'll certainly cover it, Steve promised. Now, we're almost out of time, but I want to ask about one more issue that's been in the news lately. Karen tensed, wondering what new ambush was coming. Senator Miller's son, Peter, recently started a consulting firm that has secured several government contracts worth millions of dollars. Critics suggest this represents a conflict of interest. How does the senator respond to those concerns? This was yet another topic Karen hadn't been briefed on. She had no idea if Peter Miller even had a consulting firm. Was this real, or was Steve making it up to trap her? Karen stared at Steve, trying to hide her panic. She had never heard anything about Senator Miller's son having a consulting firm or government contracts. Was this real information or another trap? I'm not familiar with Peter Miller's business activities, she said carefully. But I can assure you that Senator Miller has always maintained the highest ethical standards and would never use his position to benefit his family. So you're unaware that Phoenix Consulting, founded by Peter Miller 6 months ago, has received $12 million in government contracts? Steve asked, looking at his notes. These contracts were awarded by agencies overseen by committees where Senator Miller holds significant influence. Karen felt dizzy. If this was true, it was a major scandal that no one had prepared her for. If it wasn't true, denying it too strongly might suggest the campaign was hiding something. As I said, I'm not familiar with those details, she repeated. But I know Senator Miller well enough to say with confidence that he would never engage in any unethical behavior. Would you consider it ethical for a senator to help his son's company secure government contracts? Steve pressed. That would depend on many factors, Karen replied, trying to buy time. Was the senator directly involved in the contracting process? Were the proper procedures followed? Was the company qualified for the work? Without knowing these details, I can't comment on a hypothetical situation. It's not hypothetical, Stevie said. It's been reported in several news outlets this week. The senator has declined to comment so far. I'm giving you the opportunity to address it now. Karen took a deep breath. She was in impossible territory. If she denied something that turned out to be true, she would look foolish or dishonest. If she acknowledged it without knowing the facts, she might inadvertently confirm something that wasn't accurate. This is exactly the kind of ambush journalism I referred to earlier, she said, deciding to go on the offensive. You're bringing up allegations that I haven't been briefed on and asking me to respond on the spot. That's not fair to me or to your viewers who deserve accurate information. Is it unfair to ask a campaign spokesperson about a story that's been in the news for days? Steve countered. It is when you know I haven't been briefed on it, Karen said. And given your pattern throughout this interview, I have to wonder if you're presenting all the facts accurately. Are you suggesting I'm making this up? Steve asked, his eyebrows raising. I'm suggesting that you may be presenting selected facts in a way that creates a misleading impression, Karen replied. That's been your approach all evening. Steve turned to the camera. For the record, everything I've mentioned about Phoenix Consulting and its government contracts has been reported by multiple news organizations and can be easily verified. We'll post links to these reports on our website after the show. He turned back to Karen. But let's set that aside. Is there anything else you'd like to tell our viewers about Senator Miller's vision for America? Karen recognized the opportunity to end on a positive note, but she was too frustrated and exhausted to take it. I think your viewers have already made up their minds, she said. This hasn't been an interview, it's been a trial. I've asked tough but fair questions based on the senator's own words and actions. Steve defended himself. That's my job. Your job is to inform, not to attack, Karen said. Every question you've asked has been designed to make Senator Miller look bad. I ask the same tough questions of all candidates and their representatives, Steve said. That's what the American people deserve. The American people deserve better than this, Karen said, standing up again and removing her microphone for the second time. This interview is over. This time, she didn't wait for Steve's response. She walked off the stage, ignoring his calls for her to come back. The audience began to murmur loudly as Steve turned to the camera. Well, that's a first, he said with a surprised expression. We'll be right back after these messages. As soon as Karen was backstage, Brad rushed up to her, his face pale. What the hell was that? He demanded. You can't just walk off national television. Watch me, Karen said, storming past him toward the green room. That wasn't an interview, it was an ambush, and you didn't prepare me for any of it. We prepared you for the policy questions, Brad said, following her. We couldn't anticipate everything he would ask. You should have warned me about the donation scandal, Karen said, gathering her things from the green room. And if Peter Miller has a consulting firm with government contracts, that should have been in my briefing materials. Brad looked confused. What are you talking about? Peter Miller doesn't have a consulting firm. Karen froze. What? Senator Miller's son is 20 years old and still in college, Brad said. He doesn't own any company, let alone one with government contracts. Then what was Steve talking about? Karen asked, bewildered. I have no idea, Brad said, pulling out his phone and quickly searching for information. There's nothing online about Phoenix Consulting or Peter Miller having government contracts. Collins made it up. Karen felt a wave of anger wash over her. He lied to me on national television to get a reaction. And he got one, Brad said grimly. Walking off was exactly what he wanted. It'll be the only clip anyone sees from this interview. So, I should have just sat there and let him continue to ambush me with false information? Karen asked incredulously. You should have called him out, Brad said. You should have said, that's not true, Peter Miller is a college student who doesn't own any consulting firm. That would have exposed his tactics. Karen sank into a chair, the full weight of what had happened hitting her. But I didn't know that. I wasn't sure if it was true or not. That's the problem, Brad said. They knew you wouldn't be prepared for that question. They knew you would either have to deny it without being certain or admit you didn't know. Either way, you would look bad. So what happens now? Karen asked, suddenly feeling very tired. Now we do damage control, Brad said, already typing on his phone. We release a statement calling out Collins for his dishonest tactics. We demand an apology from the network. We get the senator to do an interview with a friendlier outlet to counter the narrative. And my career as a spokesperson? Karen asked, quietly. Brad stopped typing and looked at her. His expression softened slightly. This isn't your fault. You were set up. But I'm the one who walked off on national television, Karen said. Twice. The second time was justified, Brad said. Collins crossed a line with that made-up story about Peter. No one can blame you for walking off after that. The public won't know it was made up, Karen pointed out. They'll just see me refusing to answer a tough question. Then we'll tell them, Brad said firmly. We'll release the college records showing Peter is a full-time student. We'll challenge anyone to find this Phoenix Consulting company that supposedly exists. We'll turn this around. Karen wasn't convinced. In politics, the damage was often done before the truth could catch up. People would remember her walking off stage, not the explanation that came afterward. I should call the senator, she said, reaching for her phone. He already called me, Brad said. He saw the whole thing live. He wants to speak with you, but not until tomorrow. Take the night to rest. Karen nodded, too exhausted to argue. What do I tell the press waiting outside? Nothing, Brad said. We go out the back way, no comments tonight. We need time to craft our response. As they gathered their things to leave, a production assistant knocked on the door. Ms. Lewis? Mr. Collins would like to speak with you before you go. Karen and Brad exchanged looks. Tell him that's not going to happen, Brad said. Actually, Karen said, standing up. I'll speak with him. Alone. Karen, that's not a good idea, Brad warned. I need to hear what he has to say, Karen insisted. Maybe he wants to apologize. Brad looked skeptical, but stepped aside. 5 minutes, then we're leaving, apology or not. Karen nodded and followed. The production assistant backed toward the stage. Instead of returning to the set, however, they turned down a different hallway that led to a small office. Steve Collins was waiting there, his tie loosened, and a glass of water in his hand. When Karen entered, he stood up. Ms. Lewis, he began, I owe you an explanation.